when the New Testament talks about some sort of imminent, terrible judgment, it's actually talking about the upcoming destruction of Jerusalem. When Jesus says at the beginning of Luke 13,
Renowned theologian N.T. Wright just revealed a compelling insight into what he calls a clear sign about the rapture, and it's shaking up traditional beliefs about the end times. When we start talking about the Apostle Paul and his letters, it's really important we understand the context he was writing in. You see, Paul didn't sit down one day and decide, hey, let me write some doctrine that'll become theology textbooks in 2,000 years. No, his letters were real-time conversations with actual communities who were facing their own specific struggles and issues. Picture yourself writing an email to a group of friends giving them advice. Only your advice ends up becoming sacred scripture centuries later. Sounds wild, right? But that's essentially what Paul's letters are. They're personal and situational responses, which means that understanding their cultural and historical background is vital to getting the true meaning.
But that was a reaction against early pagan, the paganism of the time, views of hell. And then the Middle Ages picked that up and made it more lurid and more extraordinary, with great paintings of demons dragging people down to hell and so on.
Take Paul's famous passage in 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17, for example. This is one of those classic rapture texts that many Christians point to, believing it means we'll all vanish into thin air at some point. But when Paul wrote these words, his readers weren't thinking about a futuristic sci-fi event. They were wrestling with grief and confusion about loved ones who had died before Jesus returned. They wondered, did those people miss out on the promises of Christ? Paul's comforting response was rooted deeply in the culture of his day. People in ancient times often had vivid ideas about welcoming victorious kings or generals into a city. It was common practice for citizens to leave their city gates, go out to meet the arriving dignitary, and then escort him back into the city as an honored guest. Paul's imagery of meeting the Lord in the air, then, was probably more about welcoming Christ triumphantly to a renewed earth rather than escaping away to heaven. But what happens if we misunderstand this? Well, according to theologian N.T. Wright, the implications of misunderstanding Paul's metaphor aren't trivial. They can deeply shape Christian living and ethics. You might wonder, how could something like the rapture influence everyday behavior? Wright argues that an escapist belief that Christians will simply vanish from this troubled earth can lead to passivity. If you think this world is temporary and ultimately doomed, you might not bother much with issues like injustice, poverty, or caring for the environment. Why bother fixing a sinking ship, right? But Wright insists that's precisely the wrong conclusion. Christianity, according to Wright, is about transformation and renewal, not escape. Believers are called to embody hope and justice precisely because God intends to restore creation, not abandon it. Misreading Paul can inadvertently encourage believers to withdraw from the world rather than engage actively and lovingly. This misinterpretation also dramatically affects how the church perceives its own mission and ultimate hope. Think about it. If your biggest goal is just to get out of here as quickly as possible, that drastically limits how you view evangelism, community service, and global responsibility. The church's mission, Wright insists, isn't to prep people for an evacuation, but to live as a foretaste of the renewed creation that God is bringing about. Instead of hoping for escape, the church should actively participate in God's work of renewal, bringing about justice, peace, reconciliation, and restoration in anticipation of Christ's full arrival.
If you made yourself small enough to get down through this little crack in the earth, and if you go down there, it's real enough and it's miserable enough, and Lewis is very good at painting that, but it doesn't have the capacity, as it were.
Wright reminds us that Paul's metaphor makes much more sense when viewed through the lens of first-century cultural practices. In ancient Rome, when a respected emperor or general returned victoriously from battle, the city residents didn't just hang around their homes waiting. They went out enthusiastically to meet him and accompanied him back into the city in joyful celebration. This wasn't just a casual meet and greet. It was a symbolic way of honoring the dignitary's victory and authority. Applying this imagery to Paul's language, Wright suggests Paul was saying that when Christ returns victoriously, believers won't vanish into another dimension. Instead, they'll welcome him triumphantly and joyously escort him back to the renewed, restored world. This radically shifts how we understand eschatology, giving believers a more active and hopeful role rather than a passive, escapist one. When it comes to the concept of the second coming, Wright provides another vital clarification. There's been a long-standing confusion, he explains, between apocalyptic imagery and literal events. Many Christians read the book of Revelation, for instance, and picture a catastrophic Hollywood-style end-of-the-world scenario. Wright urges us to see that the Bible's apocalyptic language, such as stars falling, moon turning blood red, and beasts emerging, is symbolic. Vivid language meant to describe cosmic shifts and divine intervention, not literal predictions of astronomical catastrophes. Just like today, when someone says, "It's raining cats and dogs," you don't rush outside expecting pets falling from the sky. Similarly, the Bible's dramatic symbolism points to profound truths. God intervening dramatically to bring justice and renewal, not necessarily literal astronomical or meteorological phenomena. Why does this distinction matter so much? Because taking these symbolic images too literally often leaves Christians paralyzed by fear or confusion, obsessing over timelines and predictions rather than embodying hope and transformation in daily life. If we understand apocalyptic imagery correctly, as symbolic expressions of God's promise to intervene, restore justice, and renew the world, it frees us from fear-driven interpretations. We stop trying to decode timelines or predict events, and instead focus our energies on aligning our lives with God's transformative purposes here and now.
Reflect the praises of creation back to the Creator. If somebody says, "I don't want to do that," if somebody, they mightn't say it in that articulate way, but if somebody, by their actions, by their life, by everything that they are.
You know, when it comes to eschatology, the big fancy term for the study of the end times, one of the most important concepts for theologian N.T. Wright is resurrection and the idea of new creation. In simple terms, resurrection isn't just about going to heaven when you die. For Wright, resurrection is all about a transformed bodily life in a renewed creation. Imagine waking up one day in a restored world, one free from pain, injustice, suffering, and death itself. Wright emphasizes that resurrection means God isn't planning to scrap creation and start over from scratch. Instead, God intends to heal, restore, and perfect this world and our bodies within it. This perspective radically changes how we think about our future and how we live right now. Wright's teachings about resurrection and new creation have had a huge influence on modern theology, particularly among academics. Scholars in seminaries and universities have taken his critiques seriously, often praising Wright for pulling Christianity back toward a more historically grounded and biblically faithful vision of the future. Rather than floating off to some spiritual heaven, Wright's view reconnects believers to their earthly responsibilities. His insights have inspired academics to rethink traditional theology, pushing conversations forward and challenging long-held assumptions. This impact isn't limited to academics. Pastors and churches have also felt the shift. Imagine walking into a church and hearing sermons not about escaping earth, but about partnering with God and making it better. Wright's perspective encourages pastors to emphasize social justice, environmental stewardship, and community transformation. Churches influenced by his thinking often become deeply engaged in practical actions, like caring for the poor, advocating for justice, or even simply cultivating beauty and hope in their neighborhoods. Wright's teachings motivate Christians not to wait passively for the end, but to actively participate in God's work here and now. Of course, Wright's critiques haven't gone unchallenged. Traditional proponents of the rapture doctrine have pushed back firmly, arguing that Wright underestimates biblical literalism and dismisses clear biblical imagery about end times. They feel Wright's interpretations might dilute urgent calls for spiritual readiness and holiness, arguing that expecting Jesus to return imminently is crucial for maintaining spiritual vigilance. These traditional theologians worry that without a literal rapture expectation, the church might grow complacent, neglecting evangelism and urgent moral living. It's a lively debate, but Wright always invites respectful, rigorous discussion, encouraging believers to dive deeper into Scripture rather than relying solely on popular traditions.
The sky, so that we have to employ some kind of spirit-engendered space travel in order to get there? The answer I received from some American friends were, yeah, there are people who really believe that. And I want to say that's simply totally misunderstand.
At the heart of Wright's theology is his powerful vision of new creation. Picture the most beautiful, peaceful scene you can imagine. Perhaps a garden blooming, communities flourishing, harmony between humans and nature. That's closer to Wright's vision of heaven and earth renewed. It's a place where God's presence fully inhabits creation, where humanity enjoys eternal, resurrected life in a perfected physical world. This vision is incredibly hopeful, providing Christians with a concrete, inspiring picture of the future, one worth working toward right now. This idea has huge implications for daily Christian living. Wright argues that if we truly grasp this vision, it changes everything about how we live. Instead of viewing life as just waiting to escape, Christians become active agents of change, bringing bits of this future restoration into the present. Simple acts of kindness, justice, mercy, and creativity become powerful glimpses of the future kingdom. Rather than living in passive waiting, Wright urges us to live hopeful, purposeful lives, knowing our efforts today echo into eternity. In contrast, Wright points out that rapture-focused beliefs often lead to an escapist mindset. People start to see the earth as disposable, ignoring problems like poverty, injustice, or environmental damage. Why care deeply if we believe we're leaving soon anyway? Wright sees this as tragically misguided. By refocusing on the promise of a renewed earth, he calls Christians away from escapism and back toward meaningful, hopeful action right here, right now. Addressing common misconceptions is something Wright frequently does, especially regarding life after death. He clarifies he's not dismissing heaven. Instead, he emphasizes heaven as a temporary, restful place before resurrection. For Wright, our ultimate destiny isn't simply going to heaven, but being raised bodily to live forever in a renewed creation. He often repeats, "Heaven is important, but it's not the end of the world." Wright gently reminds us that our real, permanent hope is resurrection and restoration, not a vague spiritual afterlife. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.